Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 19th, 2023. Happy Juneteenth. Today we are going to be talking about Senator Tim Scott from the state of South Carolina as a potential contender against President Joe Biden in the 2024 presidential election. Now, Tim Scott announced just months ago, actually, that he was running for president of the United States. It is not really much of a shock that Tim Scott is entering into the race. He has long been seen as a potential contender for the Republican Party for quite some years now. He was propped up first by Governor Nikki Haley, who is also a candidate in this race. She previously served as the UN ambassador and is now running against him nationwide. She appointed him to the Senate vacancy in which he won a full term and recently in 2022 won re-election to the United States Senate by the voters in South Carolina. Now, Tim Scott comes at a particular point of interest because, quite frankly, he's different than the rest. He's not too closely associated with Donald Trump, nor does he come across as if he is Trumpian. He has made statements that differ with President Trump, whether it comes down to election integrity or other social or economic issues. Point being, he differentiates himself from the pack. And that isn't to say that it puts him in a good position for the Republican primary. Looking at the polling numbers, he doesn't exactly poll too high. In fact, at this point in time, he's polling amongst the lowest of any of the contenders within the race, of course being the top two, Ron DeSantis and former President Donald Trump. So with that in mind, what we know is that while Tim Scott may not necessarily make it to the general election, we are going to be considering a hypothetical about why it matters if he did. Because Tim Scott, at this point in time, while not winning over the GOP base, I could very easily see winning over the American one. Allow me to explain. You see, a lot of people have been seeing Tim Scott as this nightmare scenario for Joe Biden. He's a moderate Republican in many people's eyes, even though in terms of practice, maybe not so much. But regardless, politics is about perception. What he also offers to the Republican ticket is for the first time in its history, would they be nominating a minority candidate on the top of the ticket, meaning there has never been a presidential contender who has won the nomination on the Republican side that wasn't a white male. That would be a huge contrast and something that the Democratic Party has prided itself on as the party of diversity, the party of inclusion, yet ultimately it would not work in their favor, at least in this service level distinction. Now, what I also will say is that Tim Scott is just a very strong candidate on his own. One thing very notable is that he outperformed President Trump in comparison to his South Carolina performance. We see this, okay, South Carolina is a red state, we know this. Why am I telling you this? Well, because Donald Trump only won here by less than 12 points in the 2020 presidential election. For a state that's supposed to be solidly red, Donald Trump only won by 12. Tim Scott, on the other hand, in 2022, granted what was meant to be a more Republican year and was on the national level by just a few points, you saw a significant shift in favor of Tim Scott, giving him a resounding 26-point victory across the state. 26 points when Donald Trump was winning by just 12. If that overperformance could be replicated elsewhere, Tim Scott would win in a landslide. But let's not act as if South Carolina is indicative of the rest of the nation. Let's talk more specifically about where Tim Scott really has his strengths. Now, looking at it from this outsider perspective, we do know that Joe Biden is likely going to win many of these safe Democratic states as he otherwise would. Tim Scott being in this race really doesn't change the fact that California is a blue state, nor does it change the fact that Tim Scott will win many of the same safe states that Donald Trump did in the last election. For example, states such as Arkansas and Louisiana, you will see voting overwhelmingly for Senator Tim Scott in this situation. For the sake of simplicity, we are just going to characterize a lot of these states that we know are probably going to go to the GOP at this point in time, or at least would against potentially Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. So these are the Republican states we could reasonably expect someone like Tim Scott to win. And we can also say, Joe Biden isn't exactly going to be at 180 for the remainder of the evening. If this was election night, he would probably win Virginia still. But I still think Tim Scott would give him a run for his money there, so we're going to go ahead and remove that. I do think Joe Biden would have a fair shot at the Rust Belt, a fair shot at some of the southern region states. But generally speaking, we are going to be working within this type of map here. If Tim Scott was to be the nominee for the GOP, a lot more states would open back up to being swing states, even if they do ultimately go towards the Democrats. And these come out of states such as Virginia, which went overwhelmingly to Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in comparison to some of the former margins, especially in comparison to how Al Gore and John Kerry performed in 2000 and 2004 respectively, both of them losing the state of Virginia. In 2004, Democrats lost the state of Colorado. The largest margin of victory for a Democrat in decades happened in Colorado in 2020. But that was largely in part to Donald Trump being on the ballot. Same thing in New Mexico, same thing in many of these swing states where voters pushed away from the former president that may be open or inclined to, depending on where Joe Biden is in terms of approval, in terms of situation in the race, in a future election for a more moderate Republican like Tim Scott. He also provides a dampening feature on some of these competitive races. What I mean by that is if you take a look at some of the states where minority growth and minority population is amongst the most important, for instance, in the state of Georgia, neighboring to the state of South Carolina. This is a state where Democrats heavily rely on high turnout amongst minority Americans, specifically in this state, Black Americans. You really start to see where Democrats have won most of their races on the backs of Black voters in the state of Georgia. And this isn't to say that, Tim Scott is going to really reverse any of the trends that we have seen thus far. Democrats still have a significant, overwhelming victory margin amongst minority voters, including in the 2022 Senate race in South Carolina. Minority voters, specifically, again, Black voters in the state of South Carolina, backed the Democrat over the Republican, in this case, Tim Scott. But what I will say is that identity politics, while something that both parties do shy away from, is a reality. And what we will find here is that as Joe Biden does try to ramp up minority turnout across the United States, as Democrats had done in 2020, had tried to do in 2016, you will find that there will be somewhat of a dampening effect because Tim Scott does represent the minority group of people in the country that are supposed to be the Democratic Party's most reliable base of voters. Just a few percentage points can change the tides of a few states. Georgia, in specific, in the last presidential election was decided by a margin of just 11,000 votes out of over 5 million cast. Just a few percentage points can make or break the Democratic Party's victory. And based off where we are right now, because Tim Scott isn't Donald Trump, because Tim Scott isn't Ron DeSantis, not nearly as polarizing, and can slightly make marginal improvements amongst minority voting groups, because I think it'll be standardized. I do not just think it'll be Black voters. I think it'll be Asian voters, Hispanic voters, whatever it might be. You will see an improvement for Tim Scott, marginally, but still enough to make the difference to a point where a state like Georgia, which was so close in the last election, a state like Arizona that was so close in the last election, a state like North Carolina, where Republicans already won in the last election, could reasonably go to Tim Scott. So where does that put us now? Joe Biden's at 192. Tim Scott is at 263. 83 remaining toss-up electoral votes. Nevada, New Mexico, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New Hampshire, and Maine's 1st Congressional District, which I don't know why it's not characterized yet. I apologize for that. Now it is. You're down to the wire here. I still think that Joe Biden would ultimately end up winning in Virginia, ultimately end up winning in New Mexico. But this election is not some slam dunk for President Biden. I think in many ways it would be perceived as such. If he defeats Donald Trump again, people would say, oh, it was doomed from the beginning. How could a former failed presidential contender end up winning in this election? But Tim Scott isn't that. He, again, provides a level of electability that I think is very unseen so far within the primary process. I think he is amongst the most electable Republicans that are even in consideration or even are running for president. I think he's more electable than Ron DeSantis. I think he's more electable than Nikki Haley. I think he's more electable, certainly, than Donald Trump. Which means that if Donald Trump is competitive in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, chances are Tim Scott might be as well. I will caution, though, and say that he's not Donald Trump in terms of campaign style or in terms of the ability to win over the white working class. Donald Trump had a unique ability to win over voting groups that previously voted overwhelmingly, or at least in some cases, for Democrats. And that's how he was able to flip the blue wall to red. I think Tim Scott could still do well. I think he could very well win the election. I would not be shocked if he, as the nominee, would win in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin while losing Minnesota, losing Michigan, potentially even losing the state of Nevada. I think New Hampshire is a reasonable state for Republicans to vie for, but I don't think it's going to be too winnable in 2024. Where I am right now with a potential matchup between Tim Scott and Joe Biden is about 292 to 246 tentatively. I think I could give or take potentially Michigan, potentially Nevada, and that's really the extent of where I would go. But ultimately here, what we are finding is that Tim Scott can win, and does win, in this potential matchup, which is why I think the Republican Party should definitely, at least in terms of the sake of electability, should give him a second look. But ultimately, he's not going to overcome former President Donald Trump, at least not as it stands currently. The numbers right now simply show Tim Scott in a less beneficial position than he should be, and the endorsement game is also very similar. You can see here that the list of endorsements you've seen for Tim Scott don't exactly go that far. You see, we will find it here. Let's go ahead and see some of the endorsements that we've seen for Tim Scott, you have a couple U.S. senators, one U.S. representative from South Carolina, and a number of South Carolina state senators. But beyond that, there isn't really that much. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has his own page for party endorsements in 2024. The list goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And you know what? It means that Donald Trump has a lot of support for 2024. Tim Scott, on the other hand, simply does not. However, again, and I will say this multiple times, it is fascinating that the most electable Republicans are sometimes the least likely to win the primary. If this was an issue of electability, as Democrats made 2016 and 2020, and Donald Trump is trying to make again in 2024, is that Tim Scott would be doing a lot better if this case was standardized, if people cared about this the way we think they care. On the pundit side, on the political analyst side, on the journalistic side, we seem to believe that electability matters a lot to voters. And maybe it does, except when Donald Trump is in the primary. Because had Donald Trump been out of here, I realistically think that, while Ron DeSantis would start off with the lead, would not be in this position of total dominance, at least not to the extent that Donald Trump is, which means people like Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Mike Pence would have the opportunity to platform themselves and challenge them. But the harsh reality for all of them, besides Donald Trump, is that Donald Trump is in the race. This issue of electability has been raised. It has been commented on. It has been discussed. It has been determined in many people's eyes to be a true fact of the matter that Tim Scott's nomination would, in fact, be a nightmare for Joe Biden. But it is the question about getting him there in the first place, and that doesn't look too hot. Tim Scott is uniquely equipped to win Wisconsin, to win Pennsylvania, while winning Arizona and Georgia. He could do what Donald Trump did in 2016, except better. He could take back and reverse the trends that we've seen growing for the Democrats in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Florida, in Arizona. And while he may be lacking in terms of Rust Belt appeal in a way that Donald Trump maybe wasn't back in 2016, for instance, I have him losing Michigan, whereas Donald Trump won it at least in 2016. Besides that, winning a state is winning a state. It's not proportional. It's not, this weird type of situation or voting system. No, it is ultimately decided strictly by the winner-take-all system, which means if Tim Scott is making marginal improvements in the Sun Belt region, that's good news because they don't need a slam dunk in the Rust Belt. They just need to win by one more vote than Joe Biden. They don't need a slam dunk in the southern region of the United States because they just need one more vote than Joe Biden. And Tim Scott can get the Republicans there. In terms of down ballot races as well, I think he also would provide enough of a bump. And I'm saying this not to say that he has 100% of an opportunity at winning. I think he will have a lot of hurdles to go through this nomination, and especially through a general election. I think he will still face challenges. Scandals will arise. Issues will come up. There will be times of which, if Tim Scott is the nominee, that it looks like he's going to lose. But as it stands today, with Biden's unfavorability ratings, with the state of the economy, with the state of the Republican Party, with the state of independent voters and their opinions of the president, Tim Scott is electable. He's just simply not electable in the primary, but way more so in the general election. So I'm interested to keep an eye out on where Tim Scott goes, how he's tracked, how he performs in a number of these races. You can see that in some of the statewide polls. Hopefully we'll be able to find it because there are some very fascinating statewide polls on the Republican Party side that show Tim Scott in a little bit more of a favorable position, but still not in the best one. Let's see South Carolina if we can find a poll there too, because that's his home state. He doesn't do super well here either, which is why I'm not super, convinced that he's going to do well in this primary, but I think he's been doing a little bit better, obviously, in his home state. You can see that in the most recent South Carolina poll, he comes in third place, above Nikki Haley, the governor who appointed him in the first place, which is interesting. I think it definitely shows that Tim Scott has at least some level of core support, but who's he losing to? Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, and he's practically tied with Nikki Haley. In many other states, he's improving off the 1 to 2% that he's at nationwide to 3, 4, 5%, depending on the state, but that obviously isn't enough. I will say, too, while Tim Scott may not necessarily be the Republican nominee for president, he could very well be the nominee for vice president. And based off the way he's been campaigning, based off the way the pundits are talking about him, Donald Trump would benefit a lot by choosing him. He would be the Mike Pence again. He would be the tempering voice to the ticket that would show this level of presidential electability and presidential status that voters wanted with Mike Pence alongside Donald Trump. So we'll see if Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, whoever the nominee is, decides to choose Tim Scott. If he is not the nominee, it'll be a very fascinating and interesting election season, and I encourage you guys all to keep a close eye out on this race and eye out on the Republican primary, because as of right now, Tim Scott poses a major threat to Joe Biden, but at least right now the Democrats can take solace in the fact that he's not going to make it through the primary process, at least not easily or on his own. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.